Back in 1984, I met a young girl. She was just in 8th grade. Her name was Anne. She worked in the rectory in those days, answering the phones for us when the priests were out. Neither Anne nor I really thought each other would accomplish much in this world. But since then, she's studied theology and systems and administration, and now, among many things, she's a writer and a storyteller that gives me pause. Her married name now is Anne Garrido. She's a remarkable woman. She did accomplish a lot. This is a bit of a story that I heard her tell. I'm at a campfire, far from any cities. I circled around the edges of a dim orange fire outside Jerusalem around 700 years before Jesus was born, give or take a century. It wasn't a big fire. Even from a distance, I could tell it was one built for warmth and safety rather than a party. But as I drew nearer, the actual grimness of the scene became more apparent. The sheep and goats nearby looked thin, and dust they kicked up when they moved made my teeth feel gritty. The men had their heads together, speaking in hushed, somber tones. The women, scraping out the bottom of the dinner pots, looked especially haggard and chapped. I thought this might not be a fire that I wanted to hang out at until I spotted a group of giggling, wiry children squirming around an elderly woman. I'm guessing it was their grandmother, by the way the littlest ones were climbing on her. She was patting the ground next to her, encouraging them to settle down by promising a story. This looked encouraging. I love campfire stories. So I moved in that direction, unaware that the promise of a story in itself could become a contentious matter. Tell us about Lot's wife, pleaded one child. No, we heard about that last week, said another. I want to hear about the great flood. A story about lots of water sounded good in times like these, admitted the grandma. No, whined the other children. We're tired of hearing about Noah. You are right, the grandma, scanning the somberness of the camp, her eyes narrow with worry. There is another story I want to tell you tonight, and it's an important one, maybe the most important one I know. It was told to me by my grandma and her grandma before that. So I want you to listen to it, and I want you to remember it. Remember it no matter what happens in the days and the weeks and the months ahead. The seriousness in her voice brought the children and me to rapt attention. What was the story that was so important for these dusty, bone-thin children to remember? She began. God put Abraham to the test. I immediately knew where she was headed, but I was befuddled. This story had scared the bejeebers out of me as a little child. What kind of God would ask a parent to do something like that? I remember asking my own mom whether she would kill me if God told her to do so. She laughed and said, I didn't need to worry because God doesn't talk to people much anymore. As if that was supposed to be consoling. And I could tell these children might be having some nightmares soon also. As the grandma set the scene, the long walk up Mount Moriah, the gathering of stones, the placing of the wood, the children seemed to inhale, but not exhale. When she got to the part where Abraham prepared for a fire like the one right before our eyes, but with his son in the middle of it, well, one child had his hands over his ears, And as Abraham raised his knife, another's hands jumped over her eyes. Her fingers splayed just enough to peek through. There was a long pause. And then the grandma's voice rang out loud and sharp, "Abraham! Abraham, stop!" We were all frozen in place. And not just us, but the others near the fire as well. The women stopped scrubbing. The men looked up. No one moved as she finished the story about the ram from the thicket going into the fire instead of his son. The stars, the millions and billions of stars, and the sand, the millions and billions of grains of sand, and Abraham having even more descendants than that because God was so pleased with Abraham's faith. God was pleased with Abraham's willingness to make an offering of his son, asked the girl with the fingers splayed across her face. Said the grandma. Throughout all of history, from Abraham's time till now, some have thought that if they offered to God the best they had, if they offered to God their children, maybe God would end the drought, or the famine, or the flood that was making life so hard for them. Abraham wasn't the first person to feel gravely tested. Others have had that kind of faith. But then she leaned in as if to tell a great secret. What makes Abraham's faith different is that Abraham was listening attentively. He could hear God say, "Stop!" And he obeyed God's command. He found out that the God he followed was not a God who wanted death, but a God who wanted life. And all the way till this day, no matter how bad things get, no matter what our neighbors do, we who are the descendants of Abraham, the offspring of Isaac, know that God never wants us to sacrifice our children. God never wants us to sacrifice our children again. Our God abhors such a thing. There was a long silence. I doubted things were so bad that they had ever considered doing such a thing as sacrificing a child in a desperate move to regain God's favor. But then I remembered that this was 7 centuries before Jesus, and such things were not totally unknown at the time. The situation in this camp did seem pretty dire. Had such a gruesome thought crossed anyone's mind? We all sat there and listened to the fire crackling. And as I stared into that flame, I was feeling glad to know I didn't live in this century, but in 21st century America, where child sacrifice is no longer even a consideration. Thank God. But as soon as I thought that, another little voice began to surface in my mind. Is that really true? I think of just this past year. I think of the way that we as a nation have opted out of the Paris Climate Accord, uncommitted to protecting the environment for our children and our children's children. Is it true that we are utterly unwilling to sacrifice our children? I think of the tax changes that our bishops spoke out against, a reform that will raise the debt of coming generations while cutting benefits for poor families. Is it true that we are utterly unwilling to sacrifice our children? And I think of our inability to pass meaningful gun regulation in the 5 years since Sandy Hook and now Parkland, Florida. Is it true that we are utterly unwilling to sacrifice our children? And there are the dreadful, recurring lives of children terminated in the womb. And the 1 in 4 who will go to bed hungry tonight in our city, and the painful pictures of children just this past week, victims of yet another situation of incredible bombing in Syria, and dads walking away with their children in their arms. Is it true that we are utterly unwilling to sacrifice our children? Well, none of these sacrifices is made in the name of God. It seems to me we don't seem to think that God is very upset about it anymore. That God has anything to say about it at all, truth be told. Do we believe in the God of Abraham? The God of life who abhors death? Or do we still worship some God other than the one of our Jewish ancestors told us about? Do we worship the God who with great urgency yells, "Stop! Stop!" Please stop. Perhaps the most we can say is that this is a campfire we've not forgotten, and that's not a small thing. Haunting though it may be, 2,700 years later, we still know the tale. We ponder the story here, right now, this morning, 2,700 years later. We ponder the story, even if we have a hard time putting its core message into practice. I wonder if we could tell the old woman that at least we still tell the story. At least we're thinking about this stuff. Would it give her hope? Would that old woman find hope that we are still holding on to this story and telling it anew, even as we prepare to gather around our Easter fire in 2018, 2,700 years later? Is it finally time for us, each of us, in whatever way we can, especially by letters, by voting, is it time for us to say, stop, stop? This isn't what God wants. Is it finally time to say it for God to the world? Stop. My friends, I can just see that grandma leaning back with a smile on her face, looking up at the millions and billions of stars, each of which seemed to be winking back at her like distant cousins gone before. I could see that she was going to be okay, knowing the story would be told and told again. I think they were going to be okay because the God of life was still with them and rooting for them, just like God is for us. God's still with us. God's rooting for us, just like God is for us.